1 Samuel chapter 8 Introduction. In this chapter, we see 1. Samuel getting old and his sons becoming worse. Verses 1 to 3. 2. Israel rejects God and demands a king like all the nations. Verses 4 to 22. The big event in this chapter is Israel's demand for a king. There were a number of reasons for this development, but the trigger situation was because Samuel's sons were not like Samuel but accepted bribes and perverted justice. Samuel appoints his sons as judges. Verses 1 to 3. When Samuel grew old, he appointed his sons as Israel's leaders. Samuel was about 54 years of age, having discharged the office of a judge for 12 years. Due to his age, he was unable to prosecute his circuit journeys through the country. So, he confined his magisterial duties to Ramah and its neighborhood. He delegated to his sons Joel and Abijah the administration of justice in Beersheba in the southern border of the land of Canaan. Beersheba was very far, around 134 miles, 216 kilometers from Samuel's house at Ramah, where Samuel was executing the office of a judge. In the Bible, we never have a pattern of judges being appointed by men or of an office of a judge being passed from father to son. Samuel was not right to appoint his sons judges over Israel. Samuel's sons did not follow his ways. Opportunity and temptation made them do so. They turned aside after dishonest gain and accepted bribes and perverted justice. Eli's sons also did evil, so the Lord cut off Eli and his family. There is no such threat implied in Samuel's case, possibly because the sins of Eli's sons who profaned holy offerings were even greater than the sins of Samuel's sons. Having seen the greater sins of others, Samuel probably overlooked and excused the sins of his sons. The people would probably not have pressed for a king at this time had Samuel's sons proved as faithful to the Mosaic covenant as their father had been. However, Samuel's two sons, Joel, meaning the Lord is God, and Abijah, meaning my divine father is Lord, disqualified themselves from leadership in Israel by disobeying the law stated in Exodus 23:6, Exodus 23:8, and Deuteronomy 16:19. Parental influence is important, but personal choices are even more determinative in the outcome of one's life. Samuel's sons are rejected as leaders over Israel. Verses 4-5. All the elders of Israel gathered. The elders of Israel are men who, because of age and good reputation, are local leaders. A gathering of elders represents substantial authority that Samuel cannot ignore. The elders did not have to accept leaders who were obviously ungodly and unfit to lead. So they gathered together at Ramah to talk to Samuel. Now make for us a king to judge us like all the nations. They wanted a kingly government in Israel. The people's request for a king was not only a wish to emulate the other nations, but also a desire for effective leadership to meet the challenge of other nations. In itself, the desire to have a king was not bad. God knew one day Israel would have a king. 400 years before this, God gave instructions to Israel about their future king. Deuteronomy 17:14-20. A king was in God's plan for Israel. The request in itself was not what displeased Samuel in God, but the dissatisfaction with God's present method of providing leadership through judges and their verbalized desire to be like all the nations was what displeased Samuel. Their distinctiveness was part of the Lord's plan for them. God's purpose in the theocratic rule for Israel was that it be superior to the other nations. Exodus 19:5-6. God saw this demand as one more instance of apostasy that had marked the Israelites since the Exodus. Numbers 14:11. So God tells Samuel, as they have done from the day I brought them out of Egypt until this day, forsaking me and serving other gods, so they are doing to you. The record of Israel's grumbling and unfaithfulness from Exodus chapter 14 to chapter 32 is briefly catalogued by God here. Here we sense God comforting and vindicating Samuel to not take it personally. The rejection of Samuel was a rejection of godly leadership. So Samuel prayed to the Lord. He prayed for the pardon of their sins and direction and help from God in this great affair. He turns to the Lord for guidance, a tribute to his lifelong habit of following the Lord's leadership. This is the right thing to do whenever we are displeased. We should never carry such troubles with us. Instead, we should do what Samuel did. God told Samuel to fulfill the people's request. This was not because their request was good or right, but because God would teach Israel through this. Verse 9. God tells Samuel to warn the nation. Now listen to them, but warn them solemnly and let them know what the king who will rule over them will claim as his rights. The sense is that Israel will not change their mind. So God told Samuel to simply forewarn them. As a warning, Samuel details for the people the procedure of the king. The extremity of warning was also given. When that day comes, you will cry out for relief from the king you have chosen, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Information creates responsibility. In telling Israel this, Samuel not only helped them make a choice, but he increased their accountability for making the right choice. They couldn't say, "We didn't know." Let's see the difference between a king and a judge. 1. A judge was a leader raised up by God, usually to meet a specific need in a time of crisis. When the crisis was over, the judge went back to doing what he did before. Whereas a king held his office as king as long as he lived. 2. In Judges 8, Gideon was offered the throne over Israel. He refused it, saying, "I will not rule over you, nor shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you." Judges 8:23. This was the heart of all the judges, and this type of leadership in Israel went on for 450 years in the promised land without a king. Acts 13:20. On the other hand, a king passed his throne down to his descendants. 3. Judges did not make a government. Kings established a standing government with a bureaucracy which can be both a blessing and a curse to the people. Samuel warns the nation of the responsibilities of having a king. Verses 10 to 18. This passage gives an account of the institution of the monarchy. The elders were interested in the functions of monarchy, but Samuel pointed out the nature of monarchy. Monarchy meant the loss of freedoms and possessions that the people presently enjoyed. God wanted Israel to know that there would be problems connected with having a king. In Israel's view, they had problems that would be solved by having a king. God wanted them to know that a king would also bring problems. They should carefully weigh the benefits against the problems. Note the recurrence of the phrase, he will take, 6 times. The grasping behavior of the kings, as described here, is faintly suggestive in content and form of the 10th commandment, do not covet. The king will exact a tithe for his purposes over and above the tithe required by the Lord in Deuteronomy chapter 14, 22 to 29, chapter 26, 12 to 15. And you yourselves will become his slaves. Verse 17. Israel endured hundreds of years of slavery in Egypt. Now, Samuel warns them that they are about to subject themselves to a new kind of slavery. The Lord gives a fair warning through Samuel. If Israel wants a king, they must realize he will be a taker and they will be his servants. Verse 18. And you will cry out in that day because of your king whom you have chosen. When the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, they cried out to the Lord, and the Lord answered and delivered them. Exodus 3:7. In Judges chapter 3, 9, 15, chapter 6, 6 to 7, chapter 10, 10, when Israel faced subsequent challenges and cried out for help, the Lord responded. However, now, because they prefer a king to the Lord will not answer their plea for deliverance from their king. It was the monarchy that totally ruined Israel. As the Lord himself expressed in Hosea 13, 9, 11, long afterward when the monarchy had run its evil course. You are destroyed, Israel, because you are against me, against your helper. Where is your king, that he may save you? Where are your rulers in all your towns, of whom you said, give me a king and princes? So, in anger I gave you a king, and in my wrath I took him away. God gave them a king in his anger. Sometimes when we are stubborn, God gratifies us in wrath. Israel's demand for a king despite God's warning. Verses 9 to 22. Israel, being like other nations, was never God's goal for Israel. God wanted to make them a special treasure to him above all people, a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. Exodus 19:6. Through Balaam, when God blessed Israel in Numbers 23:9, he said, I see a people who live apart and do not consider themselves one of the nations. The eternal God also had said in Deuteronomy 33:27-28 that he will be their refuge, and so Israel will live in safety in a grain land and new wine where the heavens drop dew. Despite God's promised providential care, Israel wanted to be just like all the other nations. They said, then we will be like all the other nations, with a king to lead us and to go out before us and fight our battles. Verse 20. God just won a spectacular battle for Israel in 1 Samuel chapter 7. Israel did not lack a king. They had a king, the Lord God. What Israel wanted was the visible personality of a king. The Lord answered Samuel, Listen to them and give them a king. Samuel evidently told the elders that their request would be granted. Samuel may have requested on his own behalf that he be allowed some time in which he could pray and consult the Lord concerning the man who would be appointed king of Israel. When Samuel heard all that the people said, he repeated it before the Lord. Verse 21. Samuel once more went over the matter. He repeated them privately between God and himself for his own vindication and comfort, seeking God's direction and assistance. Verse 22. Go every man to his city, signifying that they might return in peace and be assured that their request would be granted, and a king would be appointed in a short time, and which they might report to their fellow citizens. Meanwhile, they might rest contented that they would have one, as he already had instructions from God. Summary. In this chapter, we have a marvelous lesson about prayer. In verse 6, when the request of the elders for a king came as a severe stroke of disappointment and grief to Samuel, he took his sorrow to the Lord in prayer. And when, despite all the warnings, Israel's leaders said, "No, we will have a king," once more it is stated that Samuel repeated all the words of the people in the ears of the Lord. Verse 21. This is a great example for all believers. Take everything to the Lord in prayer. 1 Samuel chapter 8. Questions. First Samuel chapter 8. Answers.